All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Species of Concern, 4 case studies of invasive species that are headed for the Adirondacks. My name is Sean Kittle. I'm the communications coordinator with the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, and I'm going to be kicking things off for you this morning. So we have two main speakers today. Our first speaker is going to be Amy Slentz. She's the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager with the Finger Lakes PRISM. And then we're going to hand it over to Ryan McClean, who's the Terrestrial Invasive Species Project Manager with the Lower Hudson PRISM and the Ecological Stewardship Program Manager with the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference. Before we hand it over to our two main speakers, I'm going to give a quick introduction to invasive species, just so we're on the same page here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the tier system, the tier ranking system that we use here in New York State. And that's important because today we're going to be talking about Tier 1 invasive species. After that, we're going to talk about two aquatic invasive species of concern, hydrilla and quagga mussel. And then Ryan's going to talk about two terrestrial invasive species of, did I say terrestrial? Aquatic is first, and then terrestrial, spotted lanternfly and small carpetgrass. After that, we'll do a quick wrap up. And if you could please save your questions for the end, we'll have a Q&A at the end. Feel free to type your questions into the chat, especially if you don't want to come off of mute to say them, and we will go through those chat questions later. But you'll also be welcome to come off of mute and ask the questions directly if you'd like. Okay, so what is APIP? So APIP is the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, and we are one of 8 PRISMs. That's PRISM. It stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, and there's 8 PRISMs across New York State. Our service area is the Adirondack Park, and we go up north to the Canadian border, as you can see here on the map. Our program is funded by the Environmental Protection Fund, and it's administered by the New York State DEC. We are housed in the Nature Conservancy's Keene Valley office, which is here in the Adirondacks. So in a nutshell, APIP's mission is to work in partnership to minimize the impact of invasive species on the Adirondack region's communities, lands, and waters. Since invasive species are primarily spread by human activity, which you're going to hear a little bit more about later, our outreach efforts largely revolve around public education and prevention. Basically, it's a lot easier to prevent invasive species from spreading than it is to deal with them once they're here. We also do trainings to empower the public, where we teach people to identify invasive species and to do their own management of any invasives that they might find on their property. Out in the field, our team focuses on managing priority infestations, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that when I talk about the tier system. And we work both on land and in water. And lastly, we rely a lot on partners and volunteers. We have partnerships with about 30 organizations across the region. Those partners really help amplify our efforts. They help us reach more people, they help us cover more ground, and so do our volunteers. We have volunteers who have been with us for more than 20 years. They're out there surveying lakes and trails for invasive species and reporting any invasive species that they find. So you can always go to our website, adkinvasives.com, to learn more. And I will talk a little bit more about our volunteer programs later. So let's get into what makes a species invasive. So there's really two things that we look for. One is that they're not native to the region in question, and oftentimes they're moved by humans. And number two is they cause harm to the environment, the economy, or to public health. So if you look on the right here, we have 3 examples. The top one is poison ivy. I don't know anyone that likes poison ivy. It's definitely a human health concern, right? But it is native to the region, so it's not considered invasive. And below that, we have a tomato. Tomatoes are not native to the US, but they also don't present a problem regarding the environment, economy, or public health. So they are not native, but they're also not considered to be invasive. And then last but not least, that is a swallowwort flower. So this is an interesting species. It's not native, so it checks that box. But monarch butterflies don't know the difference between native milkweed and swallowwort. So in fact, swallowwort used to be considered part of the milkweed family. Unfortunately, monarchs didn't get that memo. If you know anything about monarchs, you know they rely on milkweed to complete their life cycles. Unfortunately, swallowwort has chemicals that are harmful to the caterpillars. So swallowwort is harmful to the environment and it's not native. Therefore, it is an invasive species. And just some other common characteristics of invasive species. A lot of them lack predators and parasites. So one example is the lower right-hand corner here, that red berry, that's Japanese barberry. It's a poor forage for animals in our area. It has these really nasty thorns on it that keep animals at bay, and mice love to hide under it for that reason. So the more mice, it means more ticks and more Lyme disease. So we have a couple problems with that. They invasive species can oftentimes produce many offspring and seeds. So an example of that is purple loosestrife, top left here. One plant can produce millions of seeds. You can see them on the paper there. Invasive species oftentimes can reproduce by multiple means. So this yellow flower here is yellow iris. That could reproduce by producing seeds or through these really fast growing rhizomes that spread underground. And many invasive species are generalists, which means they can handle a wide range of light, soil, moisture, and temperature conditions. Here we have the tree of heaven. That's an amazing generalist, and it's also a host species of spotted lanternfly, which we are going to hear more about in a few minutes. And last but not least, invasive species tend to monopolize resources. So once they're established, they can form a monoculture, basically just hogging all the resources in the area for themselves and making it really difficult for native species to coexist with them. And just three examples here. We have the environment. So garlic mustard is the top right, and that this plant is an invasive species, and it actually has chemicals that prevent other plants from growing around it. It kills the soil fungus that trees rely on, and it forms a monoculture, as you can see here. That's all garlic mustard. Not much else going on in that understory. And then public health, this nasty picture here in the lower left, those are burns from wild parsnip. Wild parsnip and giant hogweed produce chemical burns that react to sunlight. So you get the sap on you. And then once that's exposed to the sunlight, it causes these really bad burns. And then on the right here, we have an example of an economic impact. That's Japanese knotweed. It's growing along the edge of a highway here. And as you can see, it can completely take over roadsides. It can consume signs, guardrails, rights of way. It's a huge problem for transportation professionals. They have to spend a lot of time and money cleaning it up. It's a hazard because there's nowhere to pull over. And then, of course, if it blocks signage, that's a problem for drivers. All right, and I'm just going to go through these. There's more information about this online, but I did want to kind of touch on what the tier ranking system is in New York State, just so we're all on the same page. There are 4 tiers for invasive species. Tier 1 is prevention, Tier 2 is eradication, Tier 3 is containment, and Tier 4 is suppression. And today we're going to be focused on Tier 1 species. So what is a Tier 1 species, you ask? Well, let me tell you. Tier 1 species are not yet known to occur within a PRISM boundary. So the species you're going to hear about are not yet known to be in the Adirondacks, but they are likely to establish and spread if they are introduced. Since Tier 1 species are not yet found in the area, but they do occur in neighboring regions, PRISMs like APIP work to control these species through education, outreach, awareness, and awareness building initiatives. And we have 2 examples of Tier 1 species here, starry sandwort and porcelain berry. Okay, next we have Tier 2, which is eradication. So Tier 2 species are found in low enough abundance with suitable treatment options available to make eradication possible within the PRISM. Tier 2 species are a high priority for monitoring and management, and these species are best suited for an early detection and rapid response strategy. So getting to them as quickly as possible is important. We have water chestnut, and look at that angelica tree. Look at those thorns. Right. Come on, slides. There we go. Tier 3 is containment. Tier 3 species are likely to be too widespread or well established to be eradicated. So strategic management can contain Tier 3 species. It can contain them to their present location and slow their spread into neighboring areas that remain free of harmful infestations. And then, yeah, we have a European frogbit and tree of heaven there. A tree of heaven I talked about earlier. That's a host species for spotted lanternfly. And then last we have suppression, tier 4. So tier 4 species cannot be eradicated for the prism geography because they're considered to be too widespread or too established, and management is just frankly cost prohibitive. So in these cases, the focus shifts to limited localized suppression efforts. Basically, we're trying to target and protect high priority resources such as rare habitats, endangered species, and recreational assets. And we have Eurasian water milfoil and emerald ash borer. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy, who's going to talk about a couple Tier 1 aquatic invasive species. No, Amy, you're muted.
Unmute myself. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't forget to request control of my screen.
Yeah, it seems I think I might have control still.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like it says give up control instead of request. So we'll see how this goes. Good morning, everyone. I'm here to talk about hydrilla and the quagga mussel, which are higher tiered species in our region. Let me see if I can click through here. Oh, great. So to give you a brief overview of the Finger Lakes PRISM at the Finger Lakes Institute. So the Finger Lakes Institute is a department of Hobart and William Smith colleges in Geneva, New York, kind of in the heart of the Finger Lakes, right on the shores of Seneca Lake. So the Finger Lakes PRISM was hosted at the Finger Lakes Institute through funding with the Environmental Protection Fund through the New York State DEC. And again, that gives the Finger Lakes Institute the ability to kind of house the PRISM um, here right in the heart of the Finger Lakes. I just learned the other day that the Finger Lakes PRISM jurisdiction is about as big as New Jersey. So all of us in the PRISM organizations, we have rather small teams and we're managing a lot of land. So that comes into play a little bit later. We'll talk about why that's important. Now, Sean did a really good job of introducing us to some invasive species concepts. I think this graphic here does another good job of telling us like how we are managing our invasive species, how we prioritize the work that we're doing on these rather small teams. So this is the invasion curve. On one axis is time, and the other axis is area infested. And then over here on the right side is control cost. So basically, once a non-native species is introduced into a landscape, then you start to increase your control costs kind of exponentially here. So before that introduction happens, you're in the preventative phase. And again, we'll talk more about that. And that's kind of where that tier 1 species window is. And then very quickly you can get into eradication and then more complicated long-term management options, which become very costly to us as communities to control. This is just another look at the invasive species tier list. But again, Sean did a good job of talking us through that. This layout here might look a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to introduce you to our tier 1 species. So in the Adirondack region, hydrilla is just tier 1, but here in the Finger Lakes, it is a tier 3 species. That means that it's actually considered to be in medium abundance in our region, and we're focused on containment. So hydrilla actually originates from Asia. It was likely introduced to North America probably as an aquarium plant. Someone dumped their aquarium in a water body, and this plant was able to establish itself. It is a submerged macrophyte. So in that illustration to the right, all of that plant material, that entire plant, the stem, the roots, the root structure there is going to be submerged under the water. So it has visibly serrated whorled leaves. Whorled means that those leaves kind of wrap themselves around or stem out from the stem. Those leaves are simple, so there's one entire leaf, but the identifying characteristic here is the serrations along the leaf margin. Now I want to take a second to call out some lookalikes. Your biggest lookalike with hydrilla that's going to be actually a native species is Elodea. There's a lot of native Elodea species that have a similar structure. Again, those simple whorled leaves around the stem, but your biggest identifying characteristic with hydrilla is going to be the serrated leaf margins again. Now, this is a perennial plant that that kind of potato-like structure that you see in the root system, sort of at the bottom of the stem there. That's called a tuber. Now, tubers allow the plant to overwinter really well. So not only is this a perennial plant, but this species has an adaptation that kind of gives it a boost for survival compared to our other native species that don't have root structures like that, that don't have that kind of aggressive adaptation. So this plant overwinters really well. Another adaptation of hydrilla is that it can tolerate lower light conditions, which just means that this plant starts photosynthesizing kind of earlier in the morning or earlier in the growing season even. And then it gets a leg up on our native species that just have different, phenological characteristics for the region. Hydrilla is also really aggressive when it comes to its growth habits. So it can double its biomass every 2 weeks during the summer, which means it's really, really aggressive. It can grow multiple inches in a single day, in a single week. What that means is that it's able to create kind of dense walls or dense mats of vegetation in the water column. So it's kind of it's kind of taking up a lot of space in the water column, but once it reaches the surface, it's also creating a dense mat of vegetation. It prefers to grow in lakes, wetlands, kind of slow moving tributaries, including marinas. And I've had that highlighted for a specific reason. We'll circle back to that. So speaking of its growth habits here, that top picture is actually kind of an aerial image of a tributary in Florida. So Florida is another area of the US, including Massachusetts, Connecticut, some Midwestern areas as well. But Florida is an area that's also struggling with hydrilla. Now that those kind of dense green strips, those are actually infestations of hydrilla. So again, growing up through the water column as that bottom image is illustrating, and then creating dense mats of vegetation kind of through and through across the surface of the water as well. What that means in terms of impacts on our aquatic habitats is that it shades out and displaces, native plants that provide food and shelter for our native fish species, native macroinvertebrate species, things like that. It also decreases the dissolved oxygen in the water. So as we know, plants use CO2, but that photosynthetic process means that they're also releasing oxygen, usually at night. So an infestation of hydrilla like this is going to release, an exponentially increased amount of oxygen in the evening, but it's also taking up a lot of CO2 during the day. It can release nutrients that cause algal blooms, which also depletes the oxygen levels. So all of that using of resources in the water column is going to deplete the resources that other native species need as well, can lead to fish die-offs and other die-offs of aquatic organisms. Infestations like this can also interfere with waterfowl feeding areas and fish spawning or feeding sites. So you might hear some anglers or fishermen kind of advocating for this dense macrophyte species because in theory it creates a lot of fish habitat, creates a good place for sport fish to hide and feed. So anglers might often find themselves situated at the edge of a hydrilla infestation. But in reality, when it becomes a monoculture, when hydrilla really takes over a landscape, you get these other processes happening that decrease dissolved oxygen, the depletion of other nutrients that leads to basically the die-off of their their food sources, and then the vegetation will get so dense that these fish themselves can't really successfully live and thrive there. And then, of course, that leads to some human and economic impacts as well. The dense infestations, as you can kind of tell in the upper photo there, is going to interfere with boating, swimming, and again, fishing. And that comes back to our tourism dollars. And here in the Finger Lakes, that's going to be a huge impact for us. We've got a lot of beautiful aquatic systems that bring in a lot of tourism dollars, a lot of traffic. So that's a big concern for us. But it also disrupts the water flow in our reservoirs. It disrupts drainage and irrigation channels and things like that. It decreases waterfront property sometimes. But you know, we've got some pretty abundant, but at the same time isolated populations of hydrilla, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And then municipalities and regional agencies are going to incur a lot of costs for really complicated management. And again, I'll talk about that in the next slide, focusing on Cayuga Lake, which I have highlighted at the bottom there. So those are all the counties in the Finger Lakes PRISM jurisdiction that currently have populations of hydrilla. The largest is in Cayuga Lake. So let's take a look at that. All right, so hydrilla was first discovered in 2011 in Cayuga Lake. Emphasis on discovered there. Who knows when it was first established? That's kind of unknown to us, but it was discovered in the Ithaca area in 2011. So that's the southern end there of Cayuga Lake, which makes sense based on this distribution map. The larger the circle, the larger the population. So that was discovered in 2011, and ongoing still are systemic herbicide treatments in that kind of Ithaca outlet. Now we see that it moves upward. It moves more north in Cayuga Lake, starting with Kings Ferry or Don's Marina. Again, want to highlight that it's Don's Marina was the next location that it was discovered. So a kind of human-centric location. The entire marina was dredged, and I think I have a photo of that in here, but possibly not. But the entire marina had to be dredged, which is a very complicated process. And then the plant was also spot treated with herbicide kind of in the peripheral. So you can imagine that's a very costly management tactic. And then even more north, we're discovering it in other marine service areas. We're using systemic herbicide treatments as well as spot treatments. And that is also ongoing starting in 2020 up until now. That's 8 weekly applications every summer for the past 3 years, going on 4 years. And then where is it going to spread next? So I'm highlighting in this map that it's moving northward, and again, you can kind of tell that with the population size indicators there. So here at the Finger Lakes PRISM, you know, we're using the data collected from aquatic surveys to hopefully maybe kind of chart the trajectory of hydrilla movement in Cayuga Lake. Now we know that watercraft and human pathways are going to create those new infestations. That's probably fragmentation from watercraft and then moving hydrilla up through the lake. But we're also looking at the flow and the hydrology of the lake system and also the shoreline like shape and topography. So are there nooks and crannies basically of the Cayuga Lake shoreline that hydrilla is going to prefer and nestle into and root itself? That's kind of what we're seeing with those marine areas. So a boat might fragment a piece of hydrilla, bring it to a marina. The marina is kind of a protective little cove, slow moving water, you know, probably more stable temperatures, things like that. It's going to establish itself really quickly. So one of our jobs at the PRISM, at the Finger Lakes PRISM, is to identify those habits, those growth characteristics, and try to get ahead of it with preventative measures as well. Okay, so to keep us going, feel free to give me a time check at any point too. Uh, but to keep us moving here, let's talk about the quagga mussel. So the quagga mussel is actually a tier 4 species in our region, and that means that it is in great abundance, and basically we're just focused on that local containment or local control, local management. So the origin of the quagga mussel is Eurasia. It is a freshwater bivalve. That just means um, yes, 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 Brian. Here in the chat, hydrilla is the #1 plant species we're trying to keep out. I will have some preventative measures to drive home at the end of this, so keep an eye out for that. Quagga mussels are freshwater bivalves, basically filter feeders. They're fairly small, you know, growing probably a little bit larger than like the first knuckle of your thumb or even your thumbnail, depending on the size of your hand. And they're going to look very similar to zebra mussels, which are, you know, probably one of the most popular invasive species, maybe like a poster child in a sense, but a little bit larger. Again, very distinct though with that D shape. Something that I'll get into though, identifying characteristic of the quagga mussel is that um, in um, in opposition to the zebra mussel, it doesn't stand up on its own. So we'll get into that. We'll get into that characteristic in a second. I have a better um, photo that kind of displays that. So they're very similar. You'll often hear them talked about simultaneously. They both attach to hard and soft substrates of lakes, rivers, reservoirs, canals, and marinas. So here I have a photo of a boat prop completely infested with probably zebra and quagga mussel. Um, but our stewards, our watercraft stewards, as well as our volunteers, have seen zebra and quagga mussels attached to eelgrass, attached to other macrophytes. So these mussels really will attach to almost any kind of substrate, frankly. They can live into depths up to 400 feet, which is pretty startling, and they can survive near freezing temps, and that includes their reproductive strategies. So quagga and zebra mussels are able to reproduce in near freezing temperatures. They'll release quagga veligers, which is basically their larvae, and that will free float in the water column until they're fertilized. Now, the thing about that reproduction strategy is that the veligers will free float, but they're also able to attach to substrates themselves. So what that means is that your watercraft could be moving through, the water column could be moving through a water body. You could get veligers attached to your watercraft. The way you can tell is if you run your hand across your watercraft and you feel kind of a gritty, sandpapery or dirty feel, you probably have mussel veligers attached. So they're microscopic. You're not going to be able to see them with your eye, but they are there. You can feel them with your hand. Um, and basically, an adaptation of this species is that it's able to survive, as Sean mentioned early on. They're generalists. They can survive in a wide range of kind of climatic conditions. So here's that graphic that kind of compares the zebra mussel to the quagga mussel. This shows them at similar sizes, which I personally don't love, but they can be very similar sizes. So you know, that's fine, that's understandable. But you can see the quagga mussel doesn't have that zigzag shape. And then that bottom ridge there of the zebra mussel, this photo does a decent job of showing it. It's actually kind of flat. So when you stand the zebra mussel up on that edge, it'll stand on its own. And then that D shape is also really clear. Now with the quagga mussel, it doesn't have that shelf. It's got a convex shell, and so it's not going to lay flat when you try to stand it up. Right, right, that's right. Typically, the quagga mussel is going to be bigger than zebra mussel. Generally, they'll also have a lighter color, more light towards the hinge of their two shells, and then with brown to dark brown to black bands coming outward in that D shape as well. So a little bit different than the tier 1 species we looked at, or sorry, excuse me, the tier 3 species we looked at, hydrilla. Tier 4 you can see is a little bit different in that it's basically everywhere. So there was medium abundance in our region with hydrilla, whereas quagga mussel is tier 4. It's in great abundance, which I think the IMAP map here does a good job of displaying. Probably the quagga mussel was introduced in the Great Lakes region, likely through ballast water. So we're thinking how is a mussel transported versus a macrophyte? Macrophyte is probably going to be transported by fragmentation or getting caught in a boat motor or on a boat trailer and then transported to a new water body while that plant is still viable to kind of reseed itself. The quagga mussel is probably going to be, or any kind of mussel, frankly, is going to be transported through ballast water, coming all the way from Eurasia. That would be my guess. So probably introduced to the Great Lakes watershed and found its way into the Finger Lakes region. But similarly to hydrilla, it's going to just basically displace native species and disrupt that food chain and that balanced food web. So it's going to displace native mussels, going to decrease dissolved oxygen again. So unlike a plant species, the quagga mussel is kind of exclusively using that dissolved oxygen and giving off CO2. So if you have an infestation of quagga mussels, they're just going to be eating up all that dissolved oxygen in the water column, again, starving out, choking out literally other aquatic species that need that dissolved oxygen. The thing about invasives is that they can often produce some toxic byproducts. That goes for quagga mussels. They're going to be releasing that into the water column as well. And then all of these kind of ingredients help influence those harmful algal blooms, which is that's a whole nother webinar in and of itself, but pretty harmful byproduct of these invasive infestations. So dense infestations of quagga mussels are going to interfere with boating, swimming, fishing. They're going to clog up like pumping structures, intake structures, treatment and power facilities, as well as structurally and degrade various personal structures or personal property, excuse me, watercraft, as well as those infrastructures like docks, bridges, boats, pipes, things like that, but also attaching to that personal property, watercraft, props, personal docks, things like that. Structurally, they can degrade an area as well as chemically, as I mentioned above. And then, of course, it's pretty complicated to manage a mussel infestation. So municipalities are going to incur some kind of complicated management costs. So let's talk about those prevention strategies, and then I will hand it off to our terrestrial guest here, Ryan. Since we're talking with the Adirondack folks, and these species are still in a tier 1 stage, your #1 strategy is going to be prevention, prevention, prevention. So the way that we do that is through our watercraft inspection steward program, which I know very well. The Adirondack region has their own WISP program. And basically watercraft stewards are going to be assigned to priority launches in any region, and they're going to be inspecting incoming watercraft for attached organisms or debris, especially invasive species like hydrilla or zebra mussels and quagga mussels. But they're also going to be inspecting retrieving watercraft, so exiting watercraft. And I think that strategy is probably more effective in the Finger Lakes region, but still effective and important for the Adirondacks as well, to inspect their retrieving watercraft. Now this spider diagram is what it's called on the right here is part of our data analyses that we're collecting a tremendous amount of data at these boat launches through the watercraft stewards and the surveys that they're performing with the boating community. And this spider diagram is kind of telling us where there's the most risk of boats, high risk watercraft traveling to other water bodies. So that's from Cayuga Lake, there is that epicenter. We're seeing here that Owasco, Atisco, and Seneca Lake have the highest risk of getting hydrilla transported to their lake. But again, this data is all the way back from 2021, so I would be curious to see what a new spider diagram would look like, and if the Adirondack region, where it falls in the risk there. But that analysis comes from all of the data that we're gathering through the WISP program. We also have early detection survey teams. So early detection just means that they're out there, they're doing rake tosses, they're seeing what they pull up in their surveys, they're seeing what they pull up on their rakes, what kind of macrophytes. If they do find a fragment of hydrilla in their survey, that's kind of a red flag early on to come back to that location and see the extent of the population of hydrilla there. And then, of course, we have a lot of citizen science initiatives, education and outreach programs. So here in the Finger Lakes, we have a volunteer program, a macrophyte survey program. Community members find a water body of their choice. Maybe they have some lakefront property. They'll do a rake toss survey and tell us what they find on their rake. This is part of that early detection strategy. So we have a small team. We reasonably cannot be in every nook and cranny of the Finger Lake, keeping an eye on everything. So it's really critical work, frankly, of our volunteers that they're helping us with early detection through the macrophyte survey program. But it's also important just to be educating our public. So that's through webinars like this, disseminating information with other regions, telling them, hey, we've got this, we've got these infestations, this is what we're managing, this is what we're struggling with. You might want to be on the lookout for XYZ hydrilla, quagga mussel, for example. But it's also educating the boaters and the community in the Finger Lakes region. Again, we know that humans are huge, pathways are huge vectors. They create these really productive pathways for invasive species to kind of attach to and then reestablish themselves. So a really big strategy there is educating the public on how they are vectors and how they are pathways, and what they can do to prevent the spread, the part that they can play in the management of invasive species. And part of that, as Brian flagged earlier, is clean draining and drying. So I think with both species here, hydrilla and quagga mussels, probably the #1 preventative measure you can take as a community member is, and it's actually pretty simple, is just cleaning your watercraft, draining any places that might hold water, standing water, and then drying your watercraft. So I will take just a couple more minutes. I think I'm doing pretty well on time. I'll just take a couple more minutes to talk about clean, drain, and dry. So the gold standard with cleaning your watercraft is high temp, high pressure washes. And I know that there are boat stations around the Adirondack region that can help with that. So high temp, high pressure washes. You can also use different chemical washes to make sure that you're disinfecting your watercraft. But if you can't do some of those more complicated clean, drain, dry measures, another option is just to let your boat dry completely between uses. So we often give the minimum standard, the maximum standard of 2 weeks Of course, a lot of boaters aren't going to want to keep their watercraft out of the water for 2 weeks, or maybe that's hard for a lot of people. Maybe they use it all the time. But really important to let your watercraft dry out completely if possible, or dry it by hand, just to make sure that those aquatic species are either removed or they have the opportunity to desiccate, to dry up, die off, and then there's no risk of spreading them to another body of water where they could reestablish themselves. So clean, drain, dry is just a really easy strategy for that preventative measure for these tier 1 species. I think we're saving questions to the end, but that is my last slide before I hand it off to Ryan. I saw some questions in the chat. Sean, anything else you want me to circle back to, or should I hand it right off to Ryan?
No, I think you're good. I mean, if we have time, if there's a couple questions in the chat, you could grab them now if you want to, if
Okay,
that's
sure.
okay with Ryan. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Let's
Oops.
see what we got here. Okay, so Brian jumped in there highlighting a few species. Question here. So how do they inspect invasive species they can't see? Do they rub their hands on the boat to feel the grit? And I see that there's some other conversation happening here that goes back to clean, drain, dry standards. If a boat is wet, it will not pass inspection. The boat stewards will encourage you to visit a decontamination station and get a hot water boat wash, but it's good. It's a good point that some organisms are so small you can't see. That's right. And we tell our stewards in the Finger Lakes, so these boat inspections are voluntary. We tell them, we kind of emphasize that they are voluntary. You need to get the boater's permission to kind of interact with their watercraft. But if possible, they should be bending low, looking in the nooks and crannies in the wheel wells of the trailer and the rollers of the trailer where the watercraft might pinch something. Rub your hands along the side of the boat to see if you can feel any grit in case there are those veligers. Ask if you can inspect their fishing equipment, their live wells, their bilges, if that's if that's appropriate. Really be inspecting all the nooks and crannies of a boat. I think another tactic, if the boater is not open to that thorough of an inspection, again, they are voluntary, is just disseminating that educational information. So maybe passing them off one of these takeaways from the DEC. We hand out these towels by the hundreds, by the thousands each season. So giving them a takeaway, giving them some educational information about quagga mussels or hydrilla, or even just clean, drain, and dry and invasive species in general, leaving them with something, that connection point that, even if they don't allow for the voluntary inspection, that connection and that takeaway leaves them with some important information and hopefully persuades them to kind of be their own watercraft steward, even if they're not open to it at the boat launch with us. That was a little bit long-winded, maybe speaks a little bit more to clean, drain, and dry, but really good questions about preventative measures. I think just to make sure we have enough time, I will hand it off to Ryan. Thank you, everyone. I'll look forward to chatting more at the end.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ryan McClean. I'm going to be talking to you guys about spotted lanternfly and small carpetgrass. So spotted lanternfly is an invasive plant hopper. It's in the hemipteran order. It is a true bug. It's not a butterfly. It's not a beetle. It is a sap sucker or a plant hopper. It's native to China and Vietnam, introduced to Pennsylvania in about 2014. It's thought that it may have come over on a shipment of ornamental rocks accidentally. It feeds on over 70 different host species. However, its primary host is tree of heaven. It is a crop pest, especially on grapes and hops and apples. And it has a lot of secondary host trees like maples, walnuts, prunus, so cherries, and other shade trees and vines as well. So here in the Lower Hudson region, this is the life cycle of spotted lanternfly. We're in the first instar stage here. So you see these little nymphs that are black with white polka dots. From July through September, you've got the fourth instar here, which looks a lot more like a ladybug. It has red and black with those white spots on it. And July through December, you'll see these winged adults. And they start laying their eggs in late August, September through November. You've got these egg masses that they lay on any solid surface that are gray, and you can see them October through June. They overwinter. So in 2020, this is what the quarantined areas looked like. You can see we did not really have it in New York at that point, or we didn't know that we had it in New York at that point. It was mostly confined to Pennsylvania and Western New Jersey here. However, in 2020, we did confirm that it was in Staten Island, and our quarantined or infestation area started to grow in New York. We saw it in Port Jervis, in Sloatsburg, Orangeburg, and even Ithaca later in that year. Oops. And here's how we're looking now. So spotted lanternfly in the Lower Hudson PRISM, which goes up through Dutchess and Ulster counties here near the border of Connecticut, is well on its way to a Tier 4 widespread invasive. So really what we're focusing on in the Lower Hudson area is areas of high importance agricultural resources, and limiting the spread. So why is spotted lanternfly so successful? Well, like a lot of other invasive species, they are prolific reproducers. I heard that one egg mass can have up to 50 spotted lanternfly eggs in it. They have very few natural predators, and they are also plant generalists. So they eat and lay their eggs on a wide range of different host species. Although tree of heaven is their preferred host species, they're not specialists. They don't rely just on that tree of heaven. There are a number of impacts of spotted lanternfly. First, they have mouth parts that are sort of like straws with a really sharp point at the end. So they're sap suckers. They use their mouth part to pierce plants and suck out the sap and nutrients from that host plant. Nymphs will feed a lot on new growth, and adults will be all over the trunk and branches of plants. You can see in this picture a drip of honeydew, which I'll talk about in a second. That is what the spotted lanternfly excretes as waste. It is a sticky, sweet substance. And here is the impact of that honeydew. So honeydew is a great food source for sooty mold. So that sooty mold will grow all over leaves, foliage of plants below, and significantly reduce the photosynthetic capacity of those plants. So light can't reach the plants as well when they're covered with that sooty mold. Here you can see a bigger example of sooty mold on some vegetation below some tree of heavens here. And they also attract bees, other stinging insects, yellow jackets, wasps. The honeydew, first, it has a pretty significant impact on property owners just because the honeydew raining down on you, it's not a very pleasant experience, especially if you know what it is. And those stinging insects that it attracts can impact recreation and your ability to enjoy your own backyard as well. Economic impacts. So spotted lanternfly in Pennsylvania, they estimate 324 million annual loss due to crop damage. Again, that's primarily hops, apples, and vineyards. And you can see this apple tree here just covered in spotted lanternfly. We have a lot of different agencies working on spotted lanternfly in New York and in the Lower Hudson PRISM. The lead agency on spotted lanternfly is the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. But we also have IMAP Invasives and the New York Natural Heritage Program, the DEC, Cornell Integrated Pest Management and Cooperative Extensions, our staff here at LH PRISM. We've got our seasonal crew, the Invasives Strike Force, partners and volunteers have all been involved in our spotted lanternfly response. So a few different strategies for how we tackled spotted lanternfly. Volunteers were a big part of our efforts. We had over 100 volunteers dedicate over 1,000 hours surveying for egg masses. We also had them in parking lots and trailheads near transportation hubs, areas of likely introduction. And we had detected nearly 700 egg masses in that first spring effort that we had. In 2022 and 2023, we integrated spotted lanternfly in our survey program. So we have lots of volunteers that survey segments of trail, typically 1 to 3 miles of trail. And this was a species that we added into that survey program. For our trail survey protocol, we typically have a corridor on either side of the trail that we survey what that vegetation or other forest pest distribution is along that trail. So typically we'll have 30 by 100 feet to get a rectangle. And we typically have asked our volunteers to survey for a lot of widespread invasives. In the Lower Hudson Valley, we have 10 years of pretty robust data set on those widespread invasives along our trails. And so we've started to switch our volunteers to look for higher priority targets like the spotted lanternfly. A second strategy that we had was putting up traps. So in 2021, we had put up over 150 traps at 11 known infestations. These circle traps are window screening that have been shaped into a funnel shape, that funnel up into either a jar or a bag. And spotted lanternfly have a tendency to move up and down the tree throughout the day. So as they move up, they get funneled into that jar, and they are not too bright, so they're not really able to escape after they get trapped in that jar. If you do put a circle trap around a tree, it's really important to try and get that funnel all the way around that tree, so that they don't have an area behind that funnel where they can move up and down without being captured. We checked these every 2 weeks, can get pretty gross in that 2 weeks, especially if you have a pretty bad infestation. And we caught close to 10,000 spotted lanternflies. Vegetation management was another big strategy of ours. So there is a laundry list of both native, non-native, and invasive vegetation that the spotted lanternfly is attracted to. So the thought here is if you remove those food sources, you will significantly mitigate the level of infestation at that site. Chemical treatment is another option as well. There are insecticides that you can use that are systemic on specific trees. We had over 500 tree of heavens treated with insecticide in 2021. The pesticide that was approved for emergency use on spotted lanternfly was Safari, and we used the basal bark application. A lot of trees were retreated in 2023, and we also added a spray oil to suffocate the egg masses as well. We also have trained and deployed conservation dogs on spotted lanternfly as well. So we have dogs that are owned by the Trail Conference that are trained to smell different rare species. So rare, either invasive or native. So back when spotted lanternfly was a really prevalent and pressing issue in the Lower Hudson Valley, it was new to the region. We decided to train our conservation dogs on them, and they were deployed to a variety of high priority sites, both vineyards as well as transportation hubs, truck stops, to help determine whether or not spotted lanternfly had already infested an area, look for any cryptic egg masses, adults, nymphs at the beginning stages of an infestation, or help intercept any spotted lanternfly that is traveling along a transportation corridor. And manual cultural control is a really big part of our strategy, especially now. Of course, you can squat at and squish any spotted lanternfly that you see. Typically, you'll want to approach them from the front. They are plant hoppers, so when they are trying to escape, they will jump forward. So if you approach them from the behind, as you go to swing at them, they will just jump away. If you approach from the front, you have a much better chance of actually hitting and squishing that insect. So we had vacuum harvesting being done in 2023. We distributed 12 vacuums to different partners and removed about 10,000 nymphs in about 2 months, and had a lot of education and outreach events as well as press around our vacuuming. So our overall lessons learned, they're very likely to be introduced along roadways, trains, and other forms of transit. Building educational awareness prior to arrival will allow you to hit the ground running with volunteer efforts. And early detection and rapid response is key. Using dogs, using traps, and engaged citizens as early as possible will really help you mitigate this invasive species. Vacuums may be your best solution on a homeowner basis, especially on those nymph stages and adults on host trees. In highly infested areas, there's a lot of resources that you need to put into management, including vegetation removal, perhaps insecticide, perhaps herbicide on some of those host trees, putting up traps, surveying in the winter, looking for those egg masses, scraping or squishing them. So once spotted lanternfly does get to your region, if it does, fingers crossed and knock on wood that it doesn't, but prioritizing those prized areas, areas that are of high agricultural importance, of high recreation importance, areas that are fairly pristine and have few other invasive species, those are areas that you'll want to prioritize. And do not reinforce panic. Stay calm, provide options, and do your best to work together as a region to mitigate the impacts. I'll go ahead and move on to talk about small carpetgrass. So Arthraxon hispidus is the Latin name of this plant. It's also known as joint head grass and hairy joint grass. This is an annual. Sometimes it can be a little bit perennial as well. So an annual is something that grows from seed in one growing season, produces flower, produces seed, sets those seed, and then all of the vegetation dies, and that plant will grow from seed again the next year. So it is sometimes known to overwinter as a perennial. It is native to Asia, and it prefers moist soil and sunny conditions. This plant can form really dense colonies in riparian areas, wet meadows, and in open, moist, disturbed areas. It spreads very, very copiously through seeds, through waterways, and it can also reproduce vegetatively at nodes. So for ID of small carpetgrass, it can grow up to 18 inches tall, so about 1.5 feet. It has an oval to lance shaped leaf that's 1 to 3 inches long. It has a heart-shaped clasping leaf base. So in this second photo, you can really see that leaf base there. The leaf margins are hairy and sometimes wavy. So you can see those hairs pretty distinctly here on that second picture. In the bottom right, you can see those hairs and that wavy leaf. And the flowers are 1 to 3 inches long, and the spikes bloom in early fall. This species is often compared to Japanese stiltgrass, and that may not mean a whole lot to y'all up in the Adirondacks because you don't have nearly as much Japanese stiltgrass as we do in the Lower Hudson Valley and in New Jersey. However, Japanese stiltgrass is a huge, huge problem. It is a widespread invasive in the Lower Hudson Valley and can really create a monoculture on forest floors. So this prefers, again, wet and sunny areas, can quickly form monocultures that push out native biodiversity. And this is a C4 rather than a C3 plant. So that is the mechanism behind how these plants go through photosynthesis. And the key takeaway here is not the difference between a C4 and a C3 plant, but more that 95% of green plants are C3 plants. And so part of the reason that people believe Japanese stiltgrass is such a competitor with our native vegetation is because it is a C4 plant. It occupies a niche, it occupies a role in the environment that isn't there typically. So C4 plants are more efficient at higher temperatures, and especially as our climate is shifting, we're getting warmer and wetter weather here, typically in the Northeast. This may offer an increased competitive advantage for small carpetgrass. Prevention of small carpetgrass. Similar to clean, drain, and dry, we also like to play, clean, go. So anytime that you are going for a hike, entering a natural area, it's really good to clean your boots both before and after, but specifically after you have finished with your recreational activity. And doing so on site will help prevent seeds in dirt that have attached to your boots, to your pants, to a new site. This also applies if you are working in an area. So really taking time at the end of the day to brush off any dirt off of your tools, and use perhaps a disinfectant spray or wipe on those tools as well, to kill any microorganisms that may be attached to your tools. Early detection and rapid response are really pivotal here. If you see an infestation, reporting it online to IMAP Invasives or iNaturalist, so that land managers are aware of that infestation. I have been pulling small carpetgrass at a location for more than 5 years, and it is an annual. We get it every year before seed, and we are still pulling it. So that seed bank seems to be at least medium in length, at least 5 years. Learning and teaching that ID of small carpetgrass across your volunteers and across partner organizations will help with that early detection and rapid response effort. And using certified weed-free soil, mulch, gravel on your own personal properties and in restoration efforts will really help reduce the spread of both small carpetgrass and other invasive or non-native species. Small carpetgrass management. So here is that site that I was talking about that we've been pulling for over 5 years. We have significantly reduced the amount of small carpetgrass there. However, small carpetgrass is small. It can only grow up to about 1.5 feet. And you can see we are pulling needles from a haystack here. It is, of course, growing in and amongst native deer tongue, invasive Japanese stiltgrass, which are two species that look sort of like small carpetgrass. And so management can be a little bit tricky. However, they have very shallow roots, which make them very easy to pull and bag. So with any annual, you'll really want to pull it before it goes to seed in late summer. Pulling and managing annuals after they go to seed typically have very little effect unless you're also getting those seeds in the bag as well. However, with ripe fruit, with ripe seeds, when you go to manage something, those seeds are likely going to fall off. So really important to manage it before it goes to seed. Mowing may be a strategy, but I really worry about regrowth, especially with this species being compared pretty often to Japanese stiltgrass. We have a partner, and mowing is a recommended strategy for Japanese stiltgrass, but you have to do it right before it goes to seed. Because if you don't do it right before it goes to seed, it will continue to grow after you cut it and flower and fruit at a much lower height than it would have originally. So we have a partner that waited until very late August to weed whack a bunch of Japanese stiltgrass, and a couple weeks later, it still flowered, fruited, and dropped seed. So all of that time, weed whacking was wasted. For really large patches, a pre or post-emergent herbicide could be effective. However, manual management, if you do have the person power, is a very viable option for this species. All right, some lessons learned about small carpetgrass. It can grow in very wet areas. We had an infestation at Roundout Creek that we were managing. It was growing on either side of the creek on abandoned, really decrepit docks. And the wood was rotten. There were nails and screws sticking out, rusty out of these planks. My crew was trying to access these infestations, and it really couldn't be done very safely with the tools and person power that we had at that time. So if you do have an infestation that is in a very aquatic setting, doing a really thorough survey to determine the extent of that infestation and planning for how you're going to access those plants will be really important. And it may require boats depending on the site. Like the one at Roundout Creek, we cannot access those without boats. However, we do have sites that are adjacent to ponds and wet meadows that we can access on foot. Yep, there's that long-lived seed bank. I said that we've been pulling it for about 5 years. It's been 7 that we've been fully completely treating it. Of course, it is difficult to 100% treat a site. And so even if you leave just one individual, it still could fruit and drop seed. However, we say that completely treated, we treated 75 to 100% of an infestation. We really have an emphasis on double checking areas and using survey techniques to really hone in on that specific species. So with completely treating small carpetgrass for 7 years, we are still pulling it. And that is what I have for you for today. So I saw a few things in the chat. If I have time, I can go through and answer some of those, or I'd be happy to turn it over to you, Sean.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, if I could, I'm just going to plug a couple things really quick, and then we'll do the questions if that's okay. It'll only take a couple minutes.
Sure.
All right. Yeah, so I just want to kind of piggyback on what Amy and Ryan were talking about, especially when they got into play, clean, go, and clean, drain, dry. Those are probably some of the most important things that anyone can do, before heading into the woods or the waters anywhere you travel. But a couple other things you can do is you can become an APIP volunteer. We do have a Lake Protectors program, and we have a virtual training coming up for that. I'll talk about that in just a second, but that's coming up in 3 weeks, I believe. And then we also have a Forest Pest Hunters program, and we have a training for that. The date is not set yet, but it's generally the first or second week of August, and we'll be announcing that. And you can check our social media or just check adkinvasives.com/events, and you'll see those pop up there soon. But these are both great programs. We have a lot of volunteers participating, and this goes a long way to finding these invasive species. And of course, if you don't have time to volunteer, I totally get it. But one thing you can do is you can report invasive species using the IMAP Invasives app. You can download this onto your smartphone. You have that with you when you're hiking or you're out paddling or fishing. And if you see something that you think is an invasive species, go ahead and report it using the IMAP Invasives app. And don't be afraid to put in a wrong answer. We'd rather get one come in that is not an invasive species and say, nope, that's not an invasive species, than have an invasive species out there that we don't know about. So if you're in doubt or have any question, just take a picture and report it using that app. There are a lot of resources online. APIP has done trainings, and there are other trainings available for how to use the app, and I can share those resources in a follow-up email after this webinar. And a great way, if you're unfamiliar with terrestrial invasive species and you want to learn more, is to order one of our free field guide to terrestrial invasive species of the Adirondacks. It covers, I believe it's 28 terrestrial invasive species. 2 of them are not found in the Adirondacks. I know offhand one is spotted lanternfly, but the rest are here. It's a great resource. It fits in your back pocket, and you can use it to identify some of these plants and insects that we have here that are invasive. And then we have our suite of brochures and posters as well that you can order. If you have an Airbnb or a business or a visitor center, feel free to order some outreach materials, or you just want some more information. We will send batches of them to you for free, and you can hand them out to your guests. Okay, and lastly, I want to plug a couple of our upcoming events. The Lake Protectors virtual training is on Tuesday, June 25th from 9 to 11 a.m. So this is a great training just to learn about how to identify some of our aquatic invasive species and how to become a lake protector. And then one that I'm really excited about, we're doing this next week, is New York State Invasive Species Awareness Week, also called NISAW. And we're doing something really special for that. We've partnered with, we being APIP, we've partnered with Racket River Brewing in Tupper Lake. They've brewed up a special IPA, invasive plant ale, for us, and we're going to have a trivia night next Wednesday. There's going to be prizes. The invasive plant ale will be there. It'll be available. It'll be the launch of that new beer. Yeah, so please, if you're in the area and you feel like traveling to Tupper Lake, get a team together, up to 6 people. Come. It'll be 3 rounds of trivia. Should be a really good time. And it's not just going to be invasive species trivia. We will have some questions about that, but we'll also have some general kind of Adirondack trivia as well. So I hope to see everyone there. It's going to be a lot of fun. And again, to learn more, to register for an event, www.adkinvasives.com/events. And to learn more about invasive species or how to volunteer, same website, adkinvasives.com. Okay, so any questions? See if I can get the chat to pop up here. For some reason, it's not. Give me a second. Can anyone else access the chat? Sorry.
Oh, I can see it. I can read
Okay.
out some of the
Yeah,
questions
thank
that
you. Oh,
you
there, it just
for
popped
me.
up for me. All right.
So we have a question: in their native regions, are they as disruptive there as we are experiencing, or do they have natural controls? How do they manage infestations? I'm not super familiar with this. However, many of the species that are invasive in one region, in their native range, they do have natural controls. There are a couple of fungi that have been seen on spotted lanternfly that are being investigated right now. And we have also seen some praying mantises, some spiders attacking and eating spotted lanternfly even here. So I would imagine that they are nowhere near as disruptive in their native habitat, and that they do have natural controls. Otherwise, I imagine that they would manage spotted lanternfly infestations in a very similar way that we would here, using cultural controls, traps, squishing egg masses, squishing nymphs and adults, removing host vegetation, using insecticides and herbicides. That is my educated guess on the answer to that question, but definitely something to look into more. Great to hear that Ari has 7 different partners setting up traps in the Adirondacks this season. Will they
Um,
survive?
Oh yeah,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
just to jump in, Ryan. Yeah, so Ari is actually our new, I can see the chat now, finally it came up. I don't know what was going on, but for those of you who don't know, Ari is our new APIP's new terrestrial invasive species project coordinator. So welcome Ari, and thanks for being on today. And we have done the traps in the past as well, and so far so good. We haven't found any spotted lanternfly. So and yeah, I guess I
Fantastic.
oh, go ahead, Ryan, sorry.
The next question we had here was, will SLF survive in the Adirondacks, or is it too cool in their native regions? Do they live in cold regions? So as far as I'm aware, cold temperatures will kill spotted lanternfly, but it has to be a successive few days of cold temperatures. And those egg masses can withstand even colder temperatures than the adults can. So while the egg masses overwinter, and while the nymphs and adults can't withstand super cold temperatures, there's a lot of variability in our weather lately. Sometimes we have really warm winters, other times we have really cold winters. I would assume that yes, they can survive in the Adirondacks, but I think it would be a little bit more difficult for them to be as prolific as they are in the Lower Hudson and in southern areas. Do they eat Japanese knotweed? I wish, yeah. Not that I know of.
Do you know, do they feed on other invasives? I know like Tree of Heaven is a host species, right? Do you know if there's any other invasives in particular
Yeah,
that they like to eat?
porcelain berry is related to grape, and I've seen them on porcelain berry vines as well. A lot of the other vegetation that we've managed happen to be native species when we were removing for trying to mitigate the spread of spotted lanternfly. Those are all the questions that I see in the chat. I'm happy to answer any more questions that might come in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
likewise.
Oh, I was going to say to the person who asked about adopting a lake or a pond, you can feel free to reach out to Brian Green or myself for a little bit more information on that. And Brian mentioned that there is a sign up on our website too. So sorry to interrupt, Amy.
Oh no, just saying likewise. Let me know if I can kind of expand on anything from hydrilla or quagga mussel earlier, clean, drain, dry, all the above.
Yeah, did we miss anyone's questions? You can feel free to just unmute and ask the question if you'd like, or if you're more comfortable typing it into the chat, that's fine too.
Yeah, no real question, but just wanted to say good morning, introduce myself to folks that I haven't met yet. Amy, Sean, Ryan, thank you so much. So much good information, making me a little worried about what might be to come for the Adirondacks. But in terms of like Tree of Heaven being such a host plant for spotted lanternfly, that's very much on our radar. That's another lower tier species for the Adirondacks, but we're certainly setting up the spotted lanternfly traps around the Lake George area. That's where our Tree of Heaven populations are. So Lockhart Mountain to the south and Bolton Landing. It's amazing to be able to name these infestations on like just counting on a single hand. So I feel lucky about that, but it's an ongoing effort to really like eradicate or contain Tree of Heaven in hopes of that reducing spotted lanternfly. So thank you to you guys. Thank you to the partners for helping with the spotted lanternfly traps. I guess my follow-up question for Ryan is we're putting a lot of the traps where they would be transported into the region. So the thought is like campgrounds, boat launches, proximity to people that are traveling from elsewhere. Are you seeing spotted lanternfly infestations in like forest interiors, or do you tend to find them more on the edge and closer to the points of introduction?
Yep. So much more often they are closer to points of introduction, the exterior of forested areas, agricultural areas. They are less of a forest pest than initially thought, from everything that I've been hearing. I have not seen a ton of spotted lanternfly on the interior of forested areas myself.
Nice, appreciate it.
Gabrielle says, now I've got 4 more invasives to despise. Yeah, isn't that the way it goes? All right, well, thank you so much. Brian did put a link to the Lake Protectors information in the chat. I will send that link out in a follow-up email as well. If anyone has any other questions, please speak now or forever hold your peace. We'll say goodbye. Going once. All right, thanks so much to Ryan and Amy for speaking. Thanks for Ari, to Ari for chiming in and for introducing himself to everyone. I'll send a follow-up email in a couple days once the video is on YouTube. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye all.
Bye.
Thank you.